have some people actually listening to this. I cannot hear you live, but I did receive some questions in advance, and so I will try to address each one of those questions. There are a few other things that I wanted to address about the course in general. So by this time, we are well into week one, right? Session one. We're giving you extra time to complete the assignments related to week one because we know some people join us late and so on. So that's to be expected. And so we are now, of course, into week two as well. So we're giving you that extra time for week one. And so that's why there's, there's sort of this overlap. So let me just explain a little bit more about the way this course is structured and what these weeks deal with. So week one, of course, deals with these three major tools for looking at the global economy, the three major worldviews, right? The liberal, economic nationalist, and the structuralist worldview. And the reason I begin with that, and this is a standard way to begin with that in a course like this, is that this is really the fundamental understanding of the global economy that people have, right? These three major worldviews pretty much categorize everyone's perspective on the global economy. So you can talk to any government official, to any person doing business internationally, they will fall into one or another of these three major worldviews. So we think it's really important to begin with that because you can use these worldviews as tools to understand what is happening in the global economy, to predict if a government is going to nationalize, right, a private company, to predict whether a government is going to put in certain kinds of import tariffs or to restrict foreign investment in certain ways. So that is why this kind of understanding of the global economy is so important, that this course is a required course, right? For every Thunderbird student that receives a degree from Thunderbird, it is mandatory that every one of them take this course. And believe it or not, usually most of them take it with me. We do have other professors that teach this course, but most of them take it with me. So in any case, that's what we did in that first week. Now, in the second week, we are getting into the major institutions of the global economy, right? So we are now working on the International Monetary Fund, which has a huge impact on the business environment of specific countries you may be doing business in. So, for example, if a country you're doing business in experiences a massive financial crisis, right, the International Monetary Fund, that's its purpose, will come in and step in and provide financial assistance to that country, short-term financial assistance. The government of that country has to repay that money with interest, right, very quickly. But the idea is the International Monetary Fund doesn't want to see a particular country collapse, right, or one economy collapse, because that could bring down the whole global economy. So that's the purpose of the IMF. But of course, when the IMF provides that assistance, it imposes conditions on a country. And in other words, it'll tell the country, we're going to provide you assistance, but we don't want you to get in this kind of situation again. So we're going to impose requirements or policy changes that we want to see you make before we agree to provide you this assistance. And of course, as we know, that the policy changes, as I explained in the video lectures, of course, and you know by now, impose basically liberal policy changes on this government. In other words, the IMF says if a government is in trouble financially, it's because the government was interfering too much in the economy. It was pursuing economic nationalist policies by putting up tariff barriers, which made the industries less competitive over time, or by spending massive amounts of money, forcing that government to borrow on foreign markets, to sell government bonds, to finance its expenditures. No wonder the country is in a financial crisis. So the IMF would say, cut the spending, reduce tariffs, privatize state-owned enterprises, do various kinds of things to move the economy into a more liberal sort of approach, because that will make this country's economy work better. Now, we can debate whether that's a good approach or not, but that is the IMF's liberal approach. And so that's what we're focusing on in this week two, the impact that the IMF has on the business environment of countries. And since it's such a typical pattern, right, it means that managers that are doing business in a country that is receiving assistance from the IMF can predict what is likely to happen, the policy changes that will occur, and the impact that those policy changes will have on the business environment of the country. And since the IMF's conditions, right, are typical, so standardized, there's such a cookie cutter pattern to these conditions, right? They're imposed in almost the same way in every country. We know the impact that they usually have, and usually it puts the country's economy, at least temporarily, into a recession. So that's why these kinds of things are so useful to know this in advance, so that managers can predict what will happen, develop a more effective strategy for their company, and understand these changes and trends and developments in the global economy. That will make you a better manager. That will make you better able to, create a strategy for your company that will work out well for you in the global economy. So that's what this week 2 is all about. And so I had one question here, and by the way, I'm also in this hour, I'm going to talk a little bit about the paper, right? That you have, the required paper, 5 to 7 page double-spaced paper. I'll be talking about that. I'll also say something about the reflection papers, right, that you have every week. But I do have a question here about the content related to week 2. So this is a very interesting question. For our reflection assignment in week 2, you ask us to review Stiglitz's critique of the IMF. The video only had a few minutes during his introductory remarks where he listed his 6 concerns. There wasn't any substantive dialogue expounding, explaining, or counter-arguing those issues in detail and in greater context. So are you looking for our initial thoughts to the 6 critiques that Stiglitz presented? If not, I'm listening to the video in the way that you intended. Please let me know. If I'm not listening to the video in the way you intended, please let me know. Now, basically, what I was asking there was for you to comment on Stiglitz's critique of the IMF in the article that was required reading. So there was of course, in this course, we cannot use the actual articles. We use summaries of the articles. But there was a summary of the Stiglitz article, which is a famous critique of the IMF. And he wrote it when he was the chief economist of the World Bank. This is some years back. And what he said, the title of that article was What I Learned at the Economic Crisis. And essentially, he wrote this during the time right after the financial crisis, the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s. And what he was saying was that the IMF's approach to assisting countries in that Asian financial crisis was very flawed, was problematic. He said he had he had some issues. He did not agree with the IMF's approach to providing assistance to those Asian countries. So essentially what Stiglitz was saying, he had a critique of the IMF and its approach. And one of the main points he made in that critique was, hey, the IMF provides financial assistance to countries. That's a good thing. But the conditions that it imposes are too tough, are too difficult for developing countries experiencing a financial crisis to meet. And he focuses in on one of the conditions in particular that the IMF imposes before it provides assistance. It's the IMF says, okay, if a country is in a financial crisis, often we know that the country that is in a crisis like this got into this crisis because it was spending massive amounts of money. It was spending, had huge government expenditures, and that wasn't covered by the tax receipts, right? By the tax revenues that it was taking in. So the government had a huge budget deficit. And that government was forced to borrow money, to sell government bonds, to finance its expenditures. And that in turn led it to becoming very indebted to foreign investors who bought those government bonds, until the point that eventually the foreign debt gets so big, right? Is such a huge, massive foreign debt that this government can't pay it back, can't even pay the interest on the debt, and has to threaten default on the debt. And it's at that kind of situation where the government will turn as a lender of last resort. It turns to the lender of last resort, which is the International Monetary Fund. Right? And the government does this so because no one wants to buy its government bonds under those conditions with a huge foreign debt, and it's saying it can't even repay the debt. So then it goes to the IMF. And so the IMF will help the country under those conditions. But one of the conditions it will impose is say, we're going to help you, but you've got to cut the spending. You've got to reduce your budget deficit. Otherwise, we're just going to get back, come back here and have to help you out again. So that is why the IMF typically does impose as a condition, the government must cut spending. So Stiglitz's critique of this, right, of this condition that is so often imposed, is that a country that's experienced a financial crisis, that's usually the last thing that really, it probably wants to do. It's in a terrible crisis already. Investors are pulling their money out of the country. The country is having difficulties as it is. And here now the IMF comes along and says, we'll help you, but you've got to have a drastic cut in spending. And Stiglitz says that will put the country's economy into a recession, which will reduce the rate of growth, which will reduce the tax revenues. And so he says this is not a good solution. He would actually prefer that the government spend money. And he comments on how the United States, when it has a financial crisis, spends more money, right, to stimulate the economy, to get the economy growing again. He said it doesn't cut spending drastically. Think of our own U.S. financial crisis in 2007, 2008, 2009. That's what the U.S. did. It spent more money. We got into a bigger budget deficit temporarily, and get the economy growing again. So Stiglitz is very critical of this condition imposed by the IMF. And so I think that is one of the key things I wanted you to focus on in that article. He comments on that as one of the conditions. He says the IMF conditions are problematic. He says they might even in some cases be motivated by big corporate interests seem to have an influence, he says, on the IMF. So there's even aspects of a structuralist critique in what he is saying about the IMF. But if you look at his overall argument, he's not saying get rid of the IMF as a real structuralist would do. He's saying the IMF just should impose such harsh conditions. It should provide assistance. It should still exist. It should still engage in helping countries, but it shouldn't impose these tough conditions on countries that are experiencing crises. It should help them, but not require drastic cuts in spending, for example. So I think that's kind of the essence of his critique. The article, which I really am asking you to reflect on in that reflection paper, goes into much more depth and substance, and that is the one I wanted you to address. I didn't want you to, focus so much on the video only. I wanted you to look at the article and give a critique of the article, Stiglitz's critique of the IMF. So that's one of the key points that he makes. Now, Rogoff, who was chief economist of the IMF at the time, provided a response to Stiglitz, and in the debate, in the video you saw, he also defended the IMF, saying, how can Stiglitz say that government should, increase their budget deficit, continue spending during a crisis? Where are they going to get the money, right? They cannot borrow money. They can't sell government bonds. So, the United States, it can increase its deficit because when the U.S. has a financial crisis, foreign investors are still willing to buy U.S. government bonds to finance bigger and bigger deficits. So the U.S. can engage in this kind of situation, can spend more money, increase its deficit, and finance that deficit by selling government bonds, because the United States, anyone is willing to buy U.S. government bonds. They still see the U.S., even when it was having the crisis, as the safest investment. U.S. government bonds, treasury bills are seen as the safest investment in the whole global economy, really. So that may not be the case for a poor developing country, So if Bolivia has a financial crisis, it's probably going to be difficult for it to consider to convince foreign investors to buy Bolivian government bonds. So I think that's what Rogoff is, trying to defend the IMF's approach and coming back at Stiglitz for that. So in the reflection paper, I wanted you to focus more on the details presented in the article that Stiglitz wrote, and you do have a summary of that article. And I think that's what I wanted you to focus on. So that deals with that question that came in So I have some other interesting questions. What will be the impact of the Industria 4.0 on the global economy in 2020? So I admit I don't know what that is. Maybe that is referring to, I don't know, technological innovation in the global economy. So maybe someone who presented that can follow up, and I'll try to respond online in the discussion forum. Okay, and let me see. Okay, my question is about how to think about comparative advantage in a real-world scenario. I understand the concept when the context is confined to two goods and the opportunity cost is assessed in terms of time and how many of one good can be produced versus the other. Unfortunately, it gets very hazy for me in the context of three or more goods, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so is comparative advantage just a way of understanding, describing what would likely occur naturally, specialization, if the markets were left free to act on their own without any intervention? I can't imagine a scenario where an individual firm would base his or her production decisions on strength relative to other players versus the more typical profit-seeking behavior unless the cooperative environment was already a prior condition. So, okay, so I think what this person is asking, I think the gist of this question is, how does comparative advantage work in the real world when there are more than just two products, right? We talked about two countries, Portugal and England, and one country has a comparative advantage, right? Its comparative advantage is clothing, and I think we said that was England, right? And in the other hypothetical situation, the other country, Portugal has a comparative advantage in wine, making wine. And so we said that every country has a comparative advantage at something internally that it does better than other things. So what we were saying with that example, right, if you remember that if two countries, England and Portugal, produce two products, wine and clothing, and England is more efficient, produces clothing at lower cost, higher quality than it does wine, then we would say that England has a comparative advantage at producing clothing, and that over time, if the market forces are left, to do their thing, then what will happen is people in England will realize there are greater profits to be made in producing clothing rather than wine, that the conditions in England are more suited to that. There's people skilled at producing clothing, there's machinery and so on available. And the climate may be very unsuited to wine production in England, right? And so more and more resources, human capital, money, capital itself, right? And human resources will go into the production of clothing. And eventually England will specialize in the production of clothing. And it will export the excess clothing it needs, right? It's going to saturate the domestic market with the clothing that it produces and meet those needs of the domestic market. And then it begins exporting that clothing to other countries, in this case, Portugal, and it will make enough money that it can buy all the wine it needs from Portugal. Because Portugal will have specialized in wine, right? If we see the climate conditions are more suited to wine than to clothing in Portugal, it has a comparative advantage for wine production, then Portugal will specialize in wine. So the question is, okay, that makes sense for two countries with two products. What if there are three products? What if it's, well, we still would say, right, we could say if there's 1,000 products, 50,000 products, right, you could say, well, a country may produce some products, a selection of products. Maybe it produces 12,000 products more efficiently than it produces the other, 38,000 products or whatever it is, right? And so we would say that that country will specialize in those 12,000 products, right? And will tend to forget about those other 38,000 products. So I think it's obviously not, it gets more complex than just one product and one country and those kinds of things. But I mean, certainly you can see how this works, right? Certainly you can see that the United States has lost its comparative advantage, right? It's much more efficient at producing certain things than other things. And so you would say that the United States is really well suited, right? Because to production of technology and innovative products. And think of Silicon Valley and the incredible, talents of people that have congregated there, and the ability to pump out new innovative kinds of things. On the other hand, the United States, we're just not that competitive anymore. If you look at the low-cost manufacturing, right, the United States, that isn't really so much where, that the United States has a lot of efficiencies, right? So you could say that we have very high costs for that. In fact, it might even make more sense. You can make more money by plowing resources, human resources, capital into other things rather than low-cost manufacturing in the United States, or let's say production of coal in the United States. It's not necessarily the best. You're not going to get the most profit from that, right? I mean, there's more productive things, more things where human capital and resources and other will start to specialize and to focus and flow into other areas. If a country simply has a comparative advantage, it does some things better than others. So I think you could say that what you start to see is the United States specializing in other kinds of things, service-related kinds of industries and sort of high-tech industries and very complex industrial manufacturing, those kinds of things. And you start to see that other sectors begin to fade away. Maybe coal mining, you don't see as much, innovation going into that. You don't see as much resources going into that in the United States. You don't see as much, low-skilled manufacturing isn't really the area where the United States is putting a lot of its resources now. So I think what happens is that when it gets more complex, you see countries that, yes, it's not just one product, but a whole lot of industries or a whole lot of products where they will have that kind of specialization. So I'm hoping this is answering your question. Again, you can post on the discussion board and I can follow up online if you have further questions. So I think this is a continuation of that same question. It says, also, I would appreciate if you would please elaborate on why liberals would consider international trade to be a positive-sum game, whereas economic nationalists would consider it to be a zero-sum game. What is the line of reasoning that motivates each of these two disparate conclusions? And so I think what happens is that, each one of these worldviews, people have different assumptions, starting assumptions. And so, then ideally, right, you would look at the evidence to see if your evidence is supporting one worldview more than another. And so I think people that have the starting assumption that trade can be a positive-sum game for all nations will start with that assumption, right, that if you're trading with other countries, that all those countries, let's say in a free trade agreement, could benefit from that agreement, right? So liberals would have that starting assumption, and then they would look at evidence. They would say, okay, let's look at trade between the United States and Mexico in NAFTA. And they would say, has it benefited these countries, yes or no? They would look at, have the economies grown more? Have more jobs been produced, right? And they would say, yes, certain jobs have been lost, right? Because low-skilled manufacturing has moved, let's say, to Mexico. Other jobs have been created, and perhaps the economy has become more efficient. So they would have to look at different ways of measuring this and test the evidence, right, to see if this has been beneficial for the United States and for Mexico. And if the evidence seems to support that, then liberals would be supported in their assumptions, their starting assumption. And they would say this has been a win-win for both countries. Yes, individual sectors, individual industries have lost, right? Have disappeared even. People have lost jobs in certain sectors, but in other areas, jobs have been created that might not otherwise have existed. Companies have been allowed to be more efficient and have stayed in business because they were able to outsource the lower cost manufacturing to Mexico and keep the high-end, high value added kinds of activities, the headquarters office in the United States. And so that has brought in more profits and higher wages and those kinds of things. So liberals would say, this has been good for the United States. It's been good for Mexico. It's a win-win. Economic nationalists, on the other hand, might focus on the negative aspects of a free trade agreement like that and would say, well, we can point to certain industries have lost jobs, right? Certain sectors have been very adversely affected by this. Look at low-skill, low-cost manufacturing in Michigan, for example. A lot of that has been moved out to offshore to Mexico, to other countries, lower-cost locations. And so they would say, this has hurt that sector. And so they might focus on that. They might lose sight of the big picture, whether it has helped the country in other areas or other ways. And so that might be one way that they would come to the conclusion that it's been a loss for the United States, but a win for Mexico. So I think that each of these worldviews has its starting assumptions. And then after you start with those assumptions, then you have to look and say, okay, does the evidence support this assumption or not? And, this is not the thing about mathematics and physics and other sciences like that, is that it's very concrete. You can see, okay, did this occur or not? We can have a laboratory experiment. We have concrete results. We can prove one thing definitively, yes or no. And in this kind of situation, it's not as easy, it's not as clear-cut necessarily, whether one worldview is correct or not, right? And so people can have different opinions. And of course, there are times, right, when one worldview may explain a nation's behavior or a government's actions better than another. And so that's really the way I'm approaching it for this course. I'm not trying to be committed to one worldview or another. I'm not, letting these worldviews control my thinking. I use them as tools to try to explain the actions or predict trends and developments in the global economy. So, we can explain, okay, why did the government of country X do certain policy action? We can explain it using the economic nationalist approach. Well, they're following an economic nationalist worldview. Why did the IMF impose this condition on country Y? Well, we can explain it using the IMF's, liberal assumptions. So it's not necessarily, we don't even need to, part of this course may be that it helps clarify your own assumptions and your own worldview. And it could be that your own worldview is a combination of the three or two or something like that. But I think the real purpose of developing these worldviews and discussing them in the beginning of the course is so that we can understand how the global economy works and look at it from different angles. And we can understand why governments are behaving the way they do. And I think each one of these worldviews can be very useful at different times and in certain circumstances to understand those things. So, I think there are times when, for example, you could say that, I'm trying to think of, for example, there's a trade dispute that the United States had with the European Union. And it was over bananas. Okay, I'm just giving this as an example. And so what is very interesting about this is the United States, what the European Union did is it restricted imports of bananas from Latin America. And the European Union said, we are doing this, right? We are purposely imposing a quota and saying only a certain amount can come in from Latin America because we want to favor our former colonies in Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, the so-called ACP nations, So we're going to import more bananas from those former colonies. We feel bad that we did some bad things when we were colonists and we, colonized those countries, and maybe we didn't always treat them right. So we want to give them special privileges now. We know they export a lot of bananas. So we're going to give special preferential access to our market for those bananas from Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, and restrict the amount of bananas coming in from Latin America. So you might say, well, how did that lead to a trade dispute between the EU and the United States? Wasn't this a Latin American, European Union issue? And so, yes, but here's the thing. A very powerful, influential, wealthy U.S. corporation, Chiquita Banana, now known as Chiquita Brands International, had a lot of banana plantations in Latin America, and was very upset that this was happening. And so the United States government said, we have no interest in this case. We don't want to pursue it. Chiquita donated lots of money to both major political parties in the United States, the heads of both parties, the major political parties. And suddenly they took an interest, the US government took an interest in this case and brought this case to the World Trade Organization. Now, the structuralist view says that governments respond to influence from corporate interest, right, from the bourgeoisie. So could it be that sometimes that helps us understand the behavior of certain governments and why they're acting the way they do? I think in this case, the structuralist view would be very, very useful, right? So it doesn't mean that you have to accept all of the problems. We understand there are, serious problems with the Marxist theories and so on. I talked about that in the article I wrote for the week 1. But sometimes the structuralist explanation works very well to explain why a government does what it does, and to why major international organizations like the International Monetary Fund or the World Trade Organization or the World Bank Group do what they do. So I think that that's why these worldviews, you can use them as tools to explain, to anticipate, to predict what is likely to happen. And that can help you develop a more effective strategy for your company. So that's the purpose of these worldviews. And the underlying assumptions, the starting point is where different people, for whatever reason, have different starting assumptions. And then it's up to you as an analyst, right, as a manager, to explain what is going on to see if the evidence supports one of these worldviews in a particular case or not. So I hope that is useful in answering that question. Saludos, Dr. Nelson E. staff. Okay, so someone has, thank you. Okay, let's see. What else? I have another question. This is a very unusual question. What does neuromarketing and neuroeconomy really impact the role of the states in the economy significantly? And about the social democracy, it's still the representation of world government, of the global companies, and the same world order. So this one, I'm not quite sure I understand this question completely. And so you may want to follow up by posting on the discussion board, and I will try to answer there. So I think that, yeah, so I think we're not focusing, of course, in this course at all on anything related to world government. We are focusing on trying to explain the actions of particular individual countries' governments, and also these major international organizations, which are composed of representatives of all the major governments, the IMF and the World Bank and the WTO. So I think that's really where we're going at things with this course. Okay. So one other issue I understand that has come up, I don't see it here on any of the questions, but one other issue that I think often does come up is for the longer paper, the research paper, that as a requirement for this course, it's a 5 to 7 page double-spaced paper, so it's really not very long, but that's the same requirement I have for my students in all other courses related to this topic. And so essentially what I want you to do in that paper is to apply the three major worldviews to a current development, a current event in your country, or, and I gave some suggestions, and this is what I think might work very well, to a major trade. It could be a trade dispute in your country or in another country, right? We're interested in the global economy here, so it doesn't have to be about your country. I'm allowing you to do that if that is easier for you or if that's of great interest to you, of course. Apply the three major worldviews to a current event or a major development in your country. But let me give you some concrete examples of what I mean. So we're going to focus in this course on, in this first week, we have started to talk about the International Monetary Fund, and we're going to continue that with a focus on the IMF and South Korea case in particular, so you get an in-depth look at a specific financial crisis and how the IMF responded. It is very useful to see an in-depth example of that. So you could look at a particular financial crisis, right? And you could explain that from the three major worldviews. Someone on the discussion forum asked me, hey, I'm from the United States, can I write about how the three worldviews would explain the US financial crisis of 2008, 2009? Of course, that would be excellent, right? And you could explain the causes of it from the liberal perspective, the economic nationalist perspective, the structuralist perspective, and then the US government's response to that crisis from each of those three perspectives. And that could be your paper. And so that would be an excellent. Another person asked me, hey, I'm from Brazil. I'd like to talk about the current financial crisis going on in Brazil. And I said, you could look at that from the three major worldviews as well. But it might even be easier, and this is something I want to emphasize here, to look at, in the particular case of Brazil, to look at the massive financial crisis that occurred in Brazil in 1999. And so I even have an article that I have assigned for this week for your reading, Causes and Consequences of Brazil's Devaluation of the Real, that's the name of Brazil's currency, in 1999. And so that talks about that particular crisis. So you could go into a relatively recent historical financial crisis. I know for many of you that isn't so recent, but what I'm saying is you could talk about that, the financial crisis in Brazil in 1999, the financial crisis in Argentina in 2001, 2002, the financial crisis in Egypt, 2013 and continuing. And you could look at these crises, try to explain them from the three major worldviews, and then explain the government's response and the IMF's response and the IMF's conditions from the three major worldviews, right? And so that is how you could approach that bigger research paper. Another topic we're going to be covering in this course is the World Trade Organization and trade disputes. So you could look at a trade dispute that your own country has experienced, right? So for example, there have been some very interesting trade disputes with various countries. South Korea and the United States had a major trade dispute over DRAMs, right? And essentially what was happening here is that basically Micron Technology, a US company, was finding that Hynix, a company in South Korea, was exporting to the United States DRAMs, right? These basically the memory units in computers and so on, at very low cost. And so was subsidizing illegally the cost of these computers. And so Micron said, this is dumping, or this is basically not fair. And they are selling below the production cost, they said. They're selling below what we can compete or anyone else could sell on the market. The government is providing them assistance, so they got into a trade dispute. So, for example, that could be a very interesting trade dispute, and that was, started in the late 1990s. Mexico and the United States had a trade dispute over tuna imports, and the United States said we're not going to import tuna from Mexico because Mexico kills a lot of dolphins. When they catch their tuna, they don't do enough to protect, you know, the dolphins get caught up in the tuna nets. And so any, you know, they just grind everything up and you end up eating some dolphin meat with your tuna. So we refuse to import tuna from Mexico. Now, Mexico said this is an outrage, right? Because Mexico has improved its net methods and its collection of tuna in recent years and said this is an outrage. The United States is just doing this to protect its own tuna industry. So the Mexico said this is economic nationalist action on the part of the United States. They're just trying to protect their own interests. So we are going to take the United States to the World Trade Organization in a trade dispute over this issue. And so remember, the World Trade Organization is a liberal organization that believes in promoting free trade, resolving trade disputes, making sure that everyone follows certain rules. And so what I think is very interesting in this dispute is Mexico took the United States to the World Trade Organization and said, this is economic nationalist behavior on the part of the United States. We believe in free trade and free markets, and we are following all the rules. We should be allowed to export our tuna to the United States, and Mexico won that dispute. So I think that would be a very interesting dispute. So that is something that started way back, you know, years and years ago, but it's been recently a new twist to that dispute. So that would be a very interesting trade dispute. So financial crises, and there have been interesting financial crises at least since the 1990s. The Russian financial crisis, 1998. There's been the financial crises in Europe, right? Basically, 2012 on, we've seen financial crises in Greece and Portugal and Spain. You could write about financial crisis in any one of those countries and look at it from the three views. Look at the IMF providing assistance to that country and look at that from the three views. So I think that would be a very interesting paper. The financial crisis in Greece, for example, is ongoing, and a very recent crisis that would be interesting to talk about. So it doesn't have to be a development in your country. It could be another country that is of great interest to you. But of course, it could also be you could focus on your own country. So that is the kind of paper that I was looking for. Now, where do you get the sources for this? And so you do not have access to the Thunderbird databases that our Thunderbird students would have enrolled in the Thunderbird program, degree programs, but you do have access to the internet, right? Which of course is an excellent source. And so of course what you would want to be careful about is, you know, sometimes, as we know, the internet, you know, you can Google trade dispute between US and Mexico, tuna dispute. And so some sources are obviously better than others. So of course, you know, anything that you find from the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the New York Times, anything like that, of course, those are really respected, solid sources. Your own countries have some papers, some sources are obviously better than others, of course, right? And so I think you're going to have to exercise some judgment. And so when we grade these papers, we will look, okay, did they use adequate sources, right? Did they use solid sources? And we know we're very sophisticated about the kinds of sources, right? A source that isn't acceptable is Wikipedia. And the reason for that is, you know, anyone can make an edit in Wikipedia. I think some time back, someone as a sort of a test did, you know, pink elephants were discovered living in, you know, New York City or something like this. And so that stayed there for a day or two before it got edited out. And so that's the problem with Wikipedia, right? It hasn't been scrutinized by editors and subjected to the kind of tests and rigorous editing that other solid sources. And so, you know, if you're from, if you're from Brazil, you know, that Gazeta Mercantil is a better source than some other, I'm not going to mention some other newspapers that maybe aren't as reliable. I'm just throwing out some different names. So you know what is probably a good source. And we are very sophisticated, so we can tell if it's a good source or not. So what I urge you to do, you can use Wikipedia, but use it as a starting point. If you want to learn more about the trade dispute between the United States and the European Union on beef hormones, that's a very interesting dispute. And, you could look that up on the internet, and there would be some very reliable sources and some that maybe would not be as reliable. So I think you're going to have to use, to some extent, your own judgment on that. And I am trying to give you some guidance. I've thrown out some names of specific sources that are always generally considered to be very reliable. Financial Times, is a very great newspaper. You can easily get access to that on ft.com, for financialtimes.com. And you can search, so there are a lot of great free sources out there, and that's what's so wonderful about the power of the internet. So that's one of the things that I would recommend that you get started right away. Now, there could be some other development in your country that you would want to focus on. For example, in this course, we're going to be talking about the World Bank Group. And the World Bank, we're going to look even at a specific case of the World Bank providing financial assistance to a big consortium of companies, a big consortium of oil companies, including ExxonMobil, for a big investment in the government of Chad, in the country of Chad. And specifically, ExxonMobil wanted to build a big pipeline from Chad through Cameroon to get the oil from Chad to the ocean so they could export it to other countries. So that is a very interesting case. You could write a paper even about that. We have a case we're reading for the course related to that, but you could go into greater depth and do more research and look at that from the three views, right? You could look at a major World Bank investment project in your own country. And so if you have a specific question, I or the teaching assistants, we're ready and prepared and happy to help you. So feel free to ask questions about this at any time. I'm very happy to answer questions related to paper or is this a good source? And you can ask some of those kinds of questions. We're very happy to answer those questions for those that are taking the course. I hope you are taking it for credit. And you're verified, ID verified student, because I think you can get I think this course can really provide a lot of value to any international manager that wants to understand the global economy and the kinds of institutions that have an impact on the global economy and that can have an impact on the global business environment and can affect the way you do business. So if you can understand those things, and that's what this course is about, then you can really develop, I think, a much more effective business strategy for your company. And so that's what we're trying to do in this course. That's what this is all about. And I definitely look forward to working with all of you in this course. And what I'm hoping is that we can do another one of these sessions, live sessions, but my idea is, since we don't have 3,000 or 4,000 people at once that generally participate in these sessions, that we could find a way to make it a live interactive session. So to me, that would be much more interesting. I think then I could actually field your questions right firsthand and interact with you right in real time. And so I think that would be a great way to go. So I'm looking at this. Seems I've answered the main questions that have come in. And I'd love to do this again. I welcome this opportunity to do this again with you. And I hope that we can make the next one very interactive, live, where I'm fielding the questions firsthand. And so let me see. So while I'm sitting here, I think we have just a few more minutes. I can perhaps elaborate some more on what is coming up in the course. So I did mention that, the next session, week 3, is going to be an in-depth look at a specific case, the IMF and its response to the financial crisis in South Korea. So what's great about that is you get kind of an in-depth look at a specific financial crisis. And we have some supplemental articles that focus on the Asian financial crisis in general. And I think what you begin to see when you look at this in depth is how the IMF really works, right, when it provides financial assistance to a country. And we see that there is sort of a standardized pattern, a standardized approach that it takes. And so certainly the 3 views have very definitive opinions about the IMF's approach. Stiglitz, as I've already commented on here, has a definitive take on this. And I think, though, that you may be working in a country that experiences a financial crisis, receives assistance from the IMF. And if that happens, what this will do is this will prepare you. You will know how crises like this occur. If they do occur, how you can develop a strategy to take advantage of these crises, to benefit from them, or at least to avoid the worst consequences from them. So that's what week 3 is about. Week 4 is where we actually get into talking about the World Bank Group, and specifically the parts of it that are most relevant to international managers. And of course, that is the International Finance Corporation, which provides financial loans to corporations, even big multinational corporations. That's this week where we're going to look at that Chad Cameroon case, where the ExxonMobil and other partners in its coalition of companies got together, and that big consortium of oil companies that invested in that pipeline. Very controversial project there. So that would be a very interesting paper topic, by the way, or any other major World Bank group investment would be an interesting paper topic. And so we're going to talk about that. And so we're going to talk about how you can use IFC financing to reduce your political risk into, because then you can say, hey, we're not just investing here, this big oil companies can say, we're partnering up with the World Bank Group. And so our investment isn't just to help us make profits, it's to help develop the country. And so that's how partnering up with the IFC can provide you with an opportunity to reduce your political risk and to enhance your public relations when you go in and invest in another country. So we learn about that. We also talk about MIGA, which is the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, which is a specific political risk arm of the World Bank Group, provides political risk insurance to companies that are going into risky places. So that's another aspect of what we focus on in week 4. And then, of course, in week 5, we get into the really, I think, exciting stuff, the trade disputes and the World Trade Organization and how it resolves trade disputes. I had someone on the discussion forum mention that he's working in Afghanistan and for the government of Afghanistan and interested in how Afghanistan can make use of the World Trade Organization, could bring a dispute to the WTO. And I think that is an extremely useful thing to get out of this course, how you can bring a dispute to the WTO if you find that you can't, you're having difficulty exporting your products to another country, or you're being treated unfairly when it comes to international trade matters. There is an organization that can help you, and that's the WTO. So in week 5, we learn in great depth and great detail how that works, how you can resolve trade disputes, how you can avoid trade disputes, and how you might be affected by these trade disputes. And so I think there we have some really interesting case studies. I wrote both of them. And so I think you'll find that that is a very useful portion of the course as well. I do go to Geneva every year. I visit World Trade Organization every year in Geneva, its headquarters. And so that those case studies I wrote sort of grew out of that involvement I have with the WTO. So in any case, that's what the course is essentially all about. And I welcome additional questions. You can post them, of course, on the discussion board. I don't know if you've noticed, but I have responded to every, at least until last night, late last night, my time, I have responded to every single post put in the discussion forum, 100%. So I don't know if that is the way it always works for these courses, but that's something that I felt important to do, at least in the beginning of this course. We also have two extremely talented and knowledgeable teaching assistants, Devika and Mary, and they are working really hard to respond, and they were posting very excellent responses as well. These are very talented graduate students studying this topic, and they are real experts in their field as well. So in any case, thank you very much. I look forward to continuing to work with you. Please feel free to keep posting comments and questions and anything you might have a question about in the discussion forum. I'm happy to respond, and we have a whole team here helping you respond to these kinds of issues. And I look forward to continuing to work with you for the remaining weeks in this course. Welcome. And I think this is going to be a great, intensive, not easy, but a very great learning experience for all of us. And welcome to the course. Thank you. Look forward to the next interactive office hour that we'll have in the future. Thank you.